Ask questions about the reading after the second presentation, if that works. Okay, tell me your name again, I forgot.
It's João Pedro.
Okay.
It's John.
Okay. I have such hard time translating the names when I hear them in Portuguese. My really bad ear.
Mine especially is difficult for you to pronounce it.
Yeah.
So you're asking why maybe women were neglected after World War, and hypothetically.
Yeah, I would love to hear other ideas.
Do you think that, for example, the contributions of German architecture after World War II was, I think, what do you think about the Cold War conjuncture?
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe the contributions of ideas of women were associated to socialist and communist ideas, and then maybe the press or some kind of Western mainstream thoughts were neglecting it, like with not by choice, by choice. They were choosing to neglect because of the alignment of possible socialist or communist ideas. That's what I thought.
No, it's a very good question, and there's no doubt that it affected some women. Like Gertrude Kochotsky was to the left, and she couldn't even practice very much in West Germany, even though, or Austria, where she lived, because they associated her with radical politics. So some of her work was actually in East Germany. And of course, Helena Sirkis, I don't know if any of you know much about her, she was very active in CM. I mentioned her in organizations yesterday. And yet, because she, for a while, I mean, she was very allied with the communist regime after World War II, and they thought she was too close to socialist realism, even though she was one of the most hardcore modernists during the 30s. Her work did change, and she was somewhat persona non grata. So I think that did affect some women. Probably the other thing is, it didn't affect all Germans, obviously, because those that emigrated, or even from Hungary, like Marcel Breuer, to the US got full recognition. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and of course, both of them also got discussed, whether in the first edition of Gideon or the second edition, and made it into the survey books. So I think your point about some of the women is really true. I don't know if it explains all of them, like the French women, but it explains some.
Yeah. We have a question from Monica. She's open here. Just give me the mic.
Monica, can you open your camera and your mic?
Yeah.
Okay, we are hearing you.
Okay, nice to see you, Monica.
Nice to see you, yeah. I was just thinking that you said that do you want to study more Egyptians? I studied the kingdoms of Le Corbusier, and I can see a huge difference between the projects before Charlotte Perriand and after Charlotte Perriand. I think there is a lack of sensibility of the architects, the men architects, about how the house works to do a good project about the interiors design. So,
Yeah. It's really true, and you're probably going to hear more than you want to hear about this in my next two talks, because when I talk about Perriand, I will talk about that, and I totally agree with you. One of the things that's interesting is that the kitchens in Le Corbusier, I'll say this again, were never published before Perriand came to the office. And so they were obviously meant for servants. They were secondary spaces. And what's curious is even in the workers' housing like Citroën, they have a room saying bon. It was standard for even lower middle class people in France, because there were no washers and dryers, to have maids. And if you were upper middle class, you often had several servants. So this all changes with World War II and the Depression even before that. But everybody is complaining in the 20s about the servant crisis. But they don't worry about the servants, and they design terrible kitchens. And even in Savoie, where there undoubtedly was a servant cooking because it was a very prosperous family, Corbusier starts wanting nice kitchens and asks Charlotte to design his own kitchen in his new apartment. So even when she's not in the office, they start getting more attention. You're so right, Monica. Any more ideas? The other idea I had about why they're excluded is, like I said, archives. But that raises the issue of why women didn't take themselves seriously enough to preserve their archives. Perriand did, and then there's the question, and I'm going to give MoMA grief again. Lily Reich's archives that they have are under Mies van der Rohe. So how do you give recognition unless you're a scholar that really digs in? Until now, they at least acknowledge that. When I was trying to find images of Gertrude Lahotsky's kitchen at MoMA, there was nothing under her name. I didn't even find them in Ernst May's housing where she did the kitchen. But they do have images. They were just buried in some category that was totally uncatalogued. So I don't know how you put this archival question on the table, but it's there. And some women, there's a Italian woman, I'm gonna forget her name, who designed, the only woman real designer in Naples in the early 50s. She designed the first skyscraper, I'm blanking. She destroyed all her archives. And so we don't know why. There was a bit of a scandal attached. Everybody in Naples had scandals with the mafia, etc. But why more women don't save their archives? It's one of my campaigns with the website, is to encourage women to save them, to encourage family members to donate letters and relevant archives. Any other questions about?
I have a question from Margaret. Is the mic on?
Oh, here it's okay.
You can go there if you wish.
No, it's okay here. Good morning, Mary, and thank you again for this marvelous lecture. I'd like to come back to architecture education.
Okay.
And why women was neglected again. I would like to ask you, or to ask you to talk to us. What do you think about a kind of tension that is still strong today between one kind of think or thought about architecture practice that still talk in terms of style, and a fight that we had in women, a very, very important force that still think in the 20s and now also that thinks that architecture is life, is experience of life, is very everyday life architecture is on life, is in life. And I guess that we have oh mon Dieu, je vais parler en français parce que mon anglais c'est terrible. Je ne sais pas, je pense que ces femmes-là des années 20, elles sont nombreuses, elles font un déplacement de l'idée de l'architecture, elles sont en train de lutter pour un déplacement de l'architecture et repenser l'architecture non en termes de style, mais en termes une réponse, une action, un geste qui concerne la vie courante, la vie du jour le jour. Je voudrais que vous développiez, s'il vous plaît, un peu ça, si vous êtes d'accord. Et la seconde chose que je voudrais dire aussi, c'est qu'on n'a pas mesuré encore suffisamment les rôles aussi des femmes, justement, parfois quand elles sont mariées, dans l'importance qui cette possibilité d'être ensemble pousse leur mari pour aller plus loin. Par exemple, moi, j'ai eu l'occasion, comme je vous ai dit hier, d'étudier un tout petit peu les rôles d'Yvonne légaliste et je vois qu'elle a pris les Corbusier puristes, non seulement elle, mais bien sûr aussi Charlotte Perrien, d'autres femmes ou d'autres hommes même qui étaient autour de lui et qui l'ont posé dans une vision beaucoup plus quotidienne de l'architecture. Et je pense enfin, je ne sais pas si vous avez étudié, outre Yvonne Légaliste, la femme de Guidon. Parce que Guidon, comme vous avez dit, a fait sa thèse avec Wolfling, mais il étudiait l'architecture du XVIIIe siècle. Et très rapidement, entre la soutenance de thèse de Guidon et Le Corbusier, ça se passe 4 ans. Et lui est déjà, avec son attention vers l'architecture moderne, et je pense que ça, c'est dû à Carole, sa femme, Carole Guidon-Walker, et je ne sais pas si vous avez étudié. Donc, c'est juste une provocation pour que vous nous parliez encore, parce que vous avez une somme d'informations et de recherches merveilleuses. Et je voudrais que vous continuiez à nous parler d'historiographie, parce que c'est ça les points.
I think Margaret has a very interesting point that I don't discuss, which probably I need to dig into further, is how some of these historians' personal lives or architects changed them. And what is a mystery with Le Corbusier is the role that Yvonne, his wife, who appears in one of the photos of the kitchen in Villeradieuse of their own apartment, or in the case of Gideon, the really interesting question of Carola Gideon, a very intelligent woman who was also trained as an art historian, but you wonder how much she challenged or changed Gideon's perspective, as well as other women in his life, like Ino Elto, who was a close friend, or later in his career, Jacqueline Tirett, who helped him with research on things like mechanization. So I think we could expand the horizon further. I can go, the next little talk I'm going to do is much shorter. It'll repeat some of the images from the first day, in a way giving you the background. But before I start with that, I just want to ask any other thoughts on why these women who were recognized at a certain moment in time before World War II got shut down after. I think the thing of the Cold War is important, some of the issues I mentioned, but do you have any other thoughts? Why did it take so long for Lina Bobardi, who's so well known in her time too, I think, when she first did map and stuff, but it took, now she's famous, but it took several decades of research and shows for the rest of the world to get to know her. And do you think it was translation or people not going to Brazil or? But on the other hand, they all knew Costa and Niemeyer, and I would propose that that was partly because of Brazil Builds and the MoMA exhibition. And even though Le Corbusier liked to claim a bigger role in the design of the ministry building, he also was a big fan, and he had his problems with Niemeyer and the UN. But they also, the other thing I would say is they got recognized in New York too, with the New York World's Fair Pavilion. But somehow the men in the 30s from Brazil got recognized. But a woman who's designing in the 50s and 60s doesn't get recognized till much later. And even Seca Pompeia, which for me is one of the great projects of that second half of the 20th century, there was this gap between it being built and being recognized outside of Brazil. So do you think it's just geography and language, or do you think it's
politics also.
So, yes,
Politics also.
very important. What is the role of the dictatorship? It's like Hitler. To what extent very big point. Political events cut off recognition. And I think Brazil closed down to the world in part during the dictatorship. Someone like Niemeyer, of course, working in France or Algeria, other places.
Yes, of course. I guess that we had a disruption in political terms, and in world in general. And in this moment, we are fighting also because the political situation now also is not so brilliant. No? And then for us women is maybe it's more difficult to cut the hegemonical way of the world is thought. Is that of course in this moment we have again a very attention of the non-human world, and this attention of everyday life and everything that is around us help us to pay attention to difference, and this is very good. But in the 20s, I guess it was a similar situation that Nazism more than all cut. It was awful. Intellectuals, designers, practitioners, people.
They fled. And it really, you're so right. And almost all the women I mentioned, many of them were Jewish. Ella Briggs, she left Austria for England. Erna Meyer leaves. Gretchen Blahotsky leaves for more political than religious background. But these women who had leftist politics or were the wrong background all left. And even those like Lily Wright, their style wasn't accepted by Nazi Germany. She did a couple of projects. Her politics we need to not wash over. But I think she was just a victim. She tried to emigrate to the US, and Mies by that point was on to other women and kind of refused to take her. So it's a complicated story. I probably should move on, but any last question before I start this? It'll be a much shorter talk. I don't want to test your patience. Or was there anyone on Zoom?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Am I situated?
You have to take the mic.
Okay. Is the computer in the way of the screen?
No.
One of the things I'd like to do in this class, and why you got those early old readings on feminism that I gave for the possible to read for today, was I think there's a kind of paradox, at least in the US, that just as feminist architectural history has become popular again, recognized, celebrated, the early work, like the people I mentioned, Gwendolyn Wright, Dolores Hayden, Susanna Stevens, has largely been forgotten. And when I would just like to ask you,
The mic.
oops, I'm sorry, forgot about it. So I'll just repeat for the Zoom people. I think some of the early research on feminist architectural history, despite the fashionability almost of some women's research, has been forgotten. And I wanted to just pose a question. Before I started talking, had any of you read Dolores Hayden before? Or even heard her name? How about Susanna Torres, since she's Argentine? No? Okay. So I guess one of the goals I have is not just to recognize these early women, but also to recognize these important historians who've also been neglected. And so what I'd like to do is give you a kind of mini survey, I hope I don't get too wordy, of the kind of history. And it's a bit biographical in that I lived through all of this. So I probably have the biases of anyone who lived through all that, and I'm happy to have them challenged. Okay. Okay, by the way, when I asked this question to an audience in Belgium, Netherlands, they all knew, most of them, like the name Beatrice Colomina or something, they'd never heard of Dolores Hayden or Gwendolyn Wright or Susanna Torres, who were really, from my point of view, the groundbreakers. But we could talk further about this. So what I'm going to propose, by the way, the image here is a woman that we talk about on the website I co-edited. There's an entry. Her name is Jane West Klaus. She was the first woman from America to work in Corbusier's office in 1931-32. And fortunately, when someone asked, how do you do research on these women, we traced down her children from her husband's obituary. Her husband, by the way, was included in Hitchcock and Johnson, Klaus, as an early modernist. But we found out through the children, she wrote a personal family memoir, we talked to them, and we were able to recreate her interesting career, and she was every bit as much a collaborator with her husband, a very good architect who designed an area of modernist housing, believe it or not, in Tennessee during the TBA era in the 30s, which is called Little Switzerland. It was very modernist in its aesthetic, but that's a detour. Okay. Tells you the context. Someone said, how did it start? I'm going to propose that the evolution of American feminist history, and forgive my bias, or I could say English-speaking history, but mostly American, can be seen as falling in three phases, reflecting the evolution of Anglo-American feminist thinking in general, not just architectural history. The first phase was closely tied with the intense change in consciousness that struck in the US in the late 60s. And it was obviously begun with the civil rights movement, then the anti-Vietnam protests, and then really the emergence of what we called women's liberation movement, but now often called second wave feminism. First wave feminism being the campaign for the vote, which really stretched from the 1860s all the way to the post-World War I period. Okay, so this first phase evolved directly out of the civil rights and anti-war movement and was spurred by American and British books such as Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique. I gave you the first chapter, The Problem Without a Name. The book was published in 1963, and it was a kind of manifesto of what was wrong with this domestic culture in the US in the 50s. Kate Millett's powerful book, Sexual Politics, first version 69, then came out mass market in 70. And this is what totally changed me personally. I read an early account of her work in the New York Times Magazine or something when I first went to college in '68. And then when her book came out, we were all transformed. And Juliet Mitchell, a very powerful book, The Feminist Woman's Estate of '71. And the feminist movement, or women's liberation, quickly became a major political and cultural force in the US and in England, one that pressed for reproductive rights. There were marches, especially in 1970, a series of marches all over the country. And it pressed, besides for reproductive rights, this is why women of my age are just scandalized that our daughters don't have the same privileges that we fought so hard for. Equal pay, still an issue in the US. Women make, now it's gone up to 81 cents for the dollar that men make for the same career and profession. Child care, we don't have public child care yet. And a radical reconstruction of gender roles, some of which succeeded. The impact on the architectural profession was almost immediate. Here are some of the signs of the period. By the mid-1970s, the number of women in university architecture programs went from just a token of being 1 or 2, which was the case for me when I started architecture school in 1972, to being nearly a third of students by '75. And by the late '70s, a flood of these young graduates began to enter practice. And they also began to organize. Contemporaneously, women architects and scholars, often outside or at the margins of academia, began to rethink the history of architecture. I already showed you Doris Cole's little book of '73, but also there were organizations, exhibitions, things like the Women in Architecture chapter of the New York AIA, the American Institute of Architects, which staged the first smaller local exhibitions. The first major exhibition, as I said, came later in '77 with Susanna Torrey. And these early women feminist architects were motivated by 2 major objectives. One was simply to recognize women designers who had been forgotten or undervalued in the history of modern architecture. And part of this was to find role models to in a way, give value to their own emergence in the profession. And the second and more radical agenda was to reconsider the nature and boundaries of the profession in order to embrace more fully women's experience. And this meant including the domestic realm, or as Margarita was saying, everyday life, the quotidian. Both goals characterize two fundamental works of this first period. Okay. Susanna Torre's exhibition that I referred to, Women in American Architecture, a Historic and Contemporary Perspective. It was sponsored by the Architecture League of New York in 1977, and the book came out afterwards. And Dolores Hayden's book that I also referred to, The Grand Domestic Revolution, A History of Feminist Designs for American Homes, Neighborhoods, and Cities. And here are some of this is a plaque from the exhibition. The book that came afterwards that Susanna Torre edited, and she included authors like Dolores Hayden and Gwen Wright in this 77 book, who later went on to publish their important books in the early 80s. Torre's modestly titled exhibition and the contemporary accompanying book had a revolutionary impact, bringing a prominence, a myriad really, of talented and innovative designers who had been previously overlooked in both the historical and contemporary press. Julia Morgan, who designed the great newspaper mogul Hearst Estate. Eleanor Raymond, who worked in Massachusetts and designed one of the very first solar houses. Marion Mahoney Griffin, who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright, but later designed with her husband the capital building of Australia. And Griswold Ting, you saw this image before, who worked with Lou Kahn and was absolutely instrumental in changing his own interests and aesthetic. And Natalie DeBloy, whom I've also showed you this image, to name just a few. This diverse and eclectic grouping challenged the very notion of a historical canon and the standard lineage of heroic male architects. Excuse me. And all of this was included in Torre's exhibition. And I say Torre because we give a name to things, but it really was a collaborative effort with group meetings, group discussions, lots of arguments. Sometimes democracy can be painful and slow, and that was certainly the case. In addition, the show and the book revealed a dimension of American architectural history that I've also alluded to previously that had been ignored. The intersection of an earlier women's movement in the United States with a vigorous campaign for domestic reform that extended from the 1860s to the 1930s, a subject explored in 3 essays in the exhibition catalog by the names I've mentioned, Dolores Hayden and Gwendolyn Wright. And I gave you, excuse me, as one possible reading, this early essay by Dolores Hayden that foreshadows her later book on Catherine Beecher, who campaigned for things long before Perriand or Gertrude Lahutsky, continuous countertops, built-in storage, called for efficiency and functionalism in her early studies. 4 years later, Hayden's groundbreaking book, The Grand Domestic Revolution, expanded on this research. Instead of discussing masterpieces of canonical figures, the book examined a series of experimental efforts to restructure living arrangements. These early feminist proposals not only anticipated many of the innovations of the modern movement that I just mentioned, but also underscored the need for contemporary transformations of the domestic realm. Wright's book, Moralism in the Model Home, though more circumscribed in scope, it focused on Chicago in the first decades of the 20th century, invested similar territory. By the way, she shows the links between Frank Lloyd Wright and these early women domestic reformers. In both books, style was not an issue. What mattered was the connection between the physical environment and the way we live. And by the way, again relating to Margarita's point, neither of these authors, Hayden or Wright, were trained as art historians. They were architects and active feminists, and they wanted to look at things that allied their two interests, and they found this really rich history in American women's history from the 1860s onward. And once again, numerous women who had been omitted from traditional architectural surveys came to the fore. Catherine Beecher, Melisande Fay Pierce, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Christine Frederick, and some of the images. Here, even before 1860, is an early book by Catherine Beecher on domestic economy. One of her images done with her sister, by the way, who was an active abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, now somewhat criticized, a book called A Woman's Home of 1869. And one of the most radical feminists, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was strongly anti-capitalist, who proposed the apartment hotel, where there would be restaurants, collective laundry, many of the ideas that later Le Corbusier would be inspired by, which some male architects like Putnam picked up on in his designs. And there, Christine Frederick, who was probably the most important proponent and publicist of the domestic reform movement. You've seen this diagram. This diagram you'll keep seeing was so important to changing the design of service spaces. Whereas the modern movement had extended the conception of architecture to women's housing, these early feminist historians reversed the equation. Housing, whether designed by architects or not, and so did these early domestic reformers, must be part of architecture and its history. A more comprehensive understanding of the intersections of material and domestic culture, they argued, was fundamental to any reformation of architecture itself. And Dolores Hayden, as I mentioned in the very first talk, invented the phrase, at least for architects, called material feminism, which I would juxtapose to rhetorical feminism. For me, both are important, but material feminism really had to do with physical space, arrangement of rooms, real material conditions, partly allied very much to their leftist politics. This same commitment to change, this fervent commitment to social change, marked the special issue of the feminist art journal Heresies that you saw floating around, published in 1981, Making Room, Women in Architecture. The process of creation, and I was part of this, and believe me, was collaborative, democratic, and consensual. I have to admit, I was part of it, which also meant long, drawn-out meetings involving endless negotiations. And I was writing my dissertation, and at a certain moment I realized it would never get done if I kept working, going to these meetings. And the process of making was as important to its participants as the final contents. It had to be done in a democratic, less hierarchical manner. But that also raises issues at times. The boldness and diversity of this phase of feminism is fully apparent in this collective endeavor, and the groundwork for many subsequent studies can be found here. despite the naivete and utopianism of some of the more revolutionary claims. The special issue included Leslie Wiseman's manifesto, A Woman's Environmental Rights, that I asked you all to read, just a 2-page statement that talks about a building that the early feminist architects took over to help women, homeless women, women with substance abuse problems, other issues. It also had proclamations of a feminist aesthetic, at times for me, sort of seriously essentialist in character. Essays on topics as varied as urban social issues, vernacular environments, women landscape architects, early European modernists such as Lily Reich and Eileen Gray, some of the first essays in English, and gender, and they questioned gender divisions, talking about non-Western spaces and the differences with Western architecture, using those words in quotes. Historical writings were interspersed with reports on alternative design practices and projects for birth centers, housing, and even a memorial dance hall dedicated to the blues singer Bessie Smith. In its optimism and activism, Making Room was similar to several other experimental endeavors of this era, including the feminist art program's exhibition, Woman's House, the Women's Building in LA of 1974, and the Women's School of Planning and Architecture founded that same year. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but the Women's Building also had an early exhibition of Eileen Gray, was very the place for Judy Chicago, Sheila de Bretteville, many early women artists, architects, graphic designers assembled. And there, that is the image I showed earlier at the end of the first lecture that was a symbol of the women's movement that the woman at the school, the summer school for women in architecture and planning, formed at the time. By the early 80s, the activist commitment to social transformation had included such traditional institutions as Columbia University, feel free, Mara, I know you have to leave, and the Society of Architectural Historians. In 1982-83, Columbia's architecture program sponsored a series of lectures on feminist perspectives of the built environment, and in 1985, Elizabeth Grossman organized the first Society of Architectural Historians session on women in architecture. For a generation of women architects, these events and publications challenged, really shook up the East Coast architectural establishment's faith in the importance of abstract, formal explorations. And I'll use Peter Eisman as my bête noire here. The Five Architects group with its arcane Corbusian explorations, or the Mannerist inversions of historicist postmodernists. In architectural history, it brought greater attention to marginal tendencies and figures, a new interest in material and social history, and a vision of scholarship as actively engaged in present-day transformations. A few years later, however, feminist thinking in architecture began to take radically different direction. Less activist, more theoretical, that is, more focused on representation than practice. The objective was to expose and dismantle oppressive gender constructions in visual imagery and discourse. A somewhat younger generation of women architects and theorists who had missed the heady days of bra burnings. I don't know whether they really existed, but lots of women threw the bras off and put them in trash cans. And communes was deeply influenced by French feminist thinkers, most notably Ella Sixou, Luz Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva. This group of feminist architects, Jennifer Bloomer, Beatrice Colomina, and Catherine Ingraham, not trained as an architect but very much part of the circle, began to examine subjects closely tied to psychoanalysis and linguistic investigations, such as the construction of self, the gaze, the inscription of binary oppositions, and hierarchies within architectural rhetoric. This direction was reinforced by a general interest in French post-structuralist theory among neo-avant-garde architects, by the way, mostly men, notably people like Eisenman and Bernard Schuming, although few women, other than Ingraham, explicitly associated themselves with either Derridian philosophy or architectural deconstructivism. At this point, feminism had become fully entrenched in the academy. It gained even a certain fashionability and currency, ironically at a time when feminist writing had become most removed from practice and from politics at large. The writing was often difficult and arcane, and for better or worse, rarely read by professional architects. And if you look at some of the issues of the early 90s of assemblage, you'll get a good dosage of this writing. I struggle still to understand Catherine Ingraham when I read her. I like her a lot as a person. This is not a personal critique. Undoubtedly, the seminal event of this second feminist phase in architecture was the conference held at Princeton University in 1990, Sexuality in Space, organized by Colomina. With only a third of the speakers trained as architects, the conference introduced to architectural criticism a wide range of perspectives about the construction of sexuality and gender from other fields: art history, anthropology, film, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and sociology. Only one of the participants, Jennifer Bloomer, showed her own designs. Tactile, messy, constructed of debris, these idiosyncratic assemblages, like Bloomer's rhetorical style, were inspired by the écriture féminine of Sixou and Catherine Clément. They could not have been more different from the earnest, socially inspired projects in the heresies issue you just saw. Subsequent conferences and publications in the 90s, such as Architecture and Fashion, 1994, White Walls, Designer Dresses by Mark Wigley in 95, often detailed analyses of gender constructions in architectural rhetoric, showing how such notions as ornament and structure were closely intertwined with gender hierarchies. And this is the same moment, and I'm going back to yesterday, that gay and lesbian theoretical writings, most notably Henry Urbach's Closets, Clothes, Disclosure, first appeared in the scene. In contrast, to the historical studies of the first feminist phase, these writings tended to be, which were, as I said, more materialist and social in construction, and introduced unknown archival material. This second phase focused on rhetoric, often scrutinizing the writings of canonical architects, male figures usually, such as Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier, to gain new perspectives on how gender was inscribed and encoded in their thought. Le Corbusier, whose urban theories had been the focus of Jane Jacobs' devastating critique in the early 60s, was once again the prime target of attack. Probably no article was published and translated as many times as Colomina's battle lines E1027, which cast Eileen Gray as a victim of Le Corbusier's hubris, jealousy, and spectral and literal defacement. But I want to add a caveat, and this article really circulated all over the world. I don't know if it's been read in Brazil, but it's probably been totally challenged in terms of its archival material by subsequent studies, including Tim Benton's excellent articles. So whatever value it had as feminist critique, I just add a word of caution. You should probably read some of the other subsequent history as well. But it was an important polemic. It almost read as a kind of movie script. Partly in reaction to the increasingly rarefied tone and hermetic focus of this phase of critical writing, and partly due to its repetitive and strident message, accusations of sexism and of denigrating the feminine, another approach began to gain prominence in feminist work in the early 90s. This phase, building on the work of Henri Lefebvre and Michel de Certeau, and revisiting the architecture and criticism of the 50s and 60s, namely the Smithsons, Jane Jacobs, Scott Brown, and Venturi, examined the everyday experience of women and other marginal groups in terms of both oppression and possibility. Feminism was now seen as part of the broader phenomenon of identity politics, and frequently feminist historical work, such as that of Margaret Crawford, Zeynep Çelik, that's the older Zeynep Çelik, and Mabel Wilson, overlapped with other investigations of identity, whether ethnic, post-colonial, or racial. Indeed, the range and variety of this work, encompassing such topics as women's patronage, which I showed you, Alice Friedman's study, post-war technology and consumption, Joan Achman's amazing essay in the sex of architecture, bodily experience by Deborah Fausch, also appears in that same book, domesticity and artworks, Sharon Haar, and women architectural critics by Diane Favreau and Suzanne Stevens, who brought to fore the work of people like Ada Louise Huxtable, makes any single characterization nearly impossible. The juncture of these diverse approaches with the social activism of the first phase and the post-structuralist psychoanalytic orientation of the second phase can be seen in the eclectic but stimulating collection I just mentioned, The Sex of Architecture, edited by the architect Diana Agrest, Patricia Conway, who at the time was the Dean of Penn, one of the early women deans, and Leslie Wiseman, who was involved in the heresy issue in 1996. This book of 24 essays can be read as a virtual group portrait of US feminist thinking in the mid-90s, one that crossed generational lines. Simultaneously, and shortly thereafter, a flurry of American and British feminist anthologies was published. And you saw most of these images earlier. Architecture and Feminism, The Architect Reconstructing Her Practice, Desiring Practices, Architecture, Gender, and Interdisciplinary, Design and Feminism, Revisioning Places, Spaces, Places, and Everyday Things, and a wonderful anthology that several British editors put together, Gender, Space, Architecture. If these works signaled a widespread acceptance of feminist concerns, they also, more disturbingly, and I'm coming to the end, marked an endpoint of feminist visibility in architecture for almost a decade or a decade and a half. The flood of publications seem to have ground to a halt. Few schools continue to offer classes of gender and architecture. Scholars in their 20s and 30s tended to find other subjects, sustainability, digitalization, and globalization, more compelling. In addition to the larger social and political forces that seem to militate against feminist scholarship, its very success over the past 3 decades may have contributed to its decline. Names of once forgotten women have been resurfaced, at least in feminist circles, maybe not in the world at large. The reputations of architecture's male heroes had been taken down a notch or two, and blatant examples of sexual inequity and discrimination in the profession had been exposed, though certainly not resolved. Much feminist scholarship and theory have been integrated into other, now mainstream pursuits. However, most feminist architectural historians and critics, certainly those of an earlier generation, would have rejected any assessment of their projects as complete, or its viability is dependent on academic fashion. And although the lull was really a kind of setback for many years, but what it does suggest is that these issues hadn't been totally resolved. And it was really quite a temporary lull, or if one that lasted nearly 20 years. There were a few books. Laurie Brown's was especially important in 2011, and MoMA, which I said was one of the great culprits in American culture, finally felt a bit guilty and published a book called Modern Women that dealt with modern artists and modern architectural designers, interior designers, exhibition designers, etc. And my optimism continues because with the past decade, especially with the Me Too movement, feminist issues and feminist architectural history has resurged again, as I hope this brief array of images will show. Some of you mentioned this, but we see a climb, and these are unfortunately just US statistics, where women enter schools, enter the profession, but as you can see, things like AIA gold medal winners, still very small statistics. You see the decline of women from being students. These are old statistics, but still challenged. Then the whole campaign that got mentioned yesterday about why Denise Scott Brown didn't get the Pritzker Prize, but at least there was a very activist campaign. And finally, in 2014, only a retrospective gold medal gets awarded to a woman, Julia Morgan. But what I can't say is there's just been a flurry of activity, a new generation of women really inspired and activist once again. Things like the organization Architect, Wikipedia campaigns. I was going to ask you if there's one in Brazil to include women on the website. Here's a session of these Wikipedia campaigns that happened at the old Guggenheim Museum. And I want to mention one organization that I've been very fortunate to be a part of, Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, which has been incredibly active in trying to resurrect women's architectural history and sponsored the website I co-edited, but so many other events all over the world. Books, more publications. Want to go back to this one. I think the revival or the publicity about Lino Bobardi, finally outside of Brazil, but also within Brazil, shows that this has really touched really continents all over the world. Thanks. Okay. Oh, great. I'm so glad you worked on the issue.
Thaisa, você tá aí? Tá ouvindo a gente?
Come sit down. We can turn off the images if you want and just have the Zoom people.
I can take off the PowerPoint. Do you want
We say,
or you want
we don't need the PowerPoint at all. Maybe the people on Zoom who want to show their face.
Thaisa?
Oi.
Oi, pra você fazer o resumo.
And I think you should be in the camera
Estava
while you
baixinho
make
o
your
áudio, com certeza,
presentation.
estavam me chamando.
No, she wanna talk to you.
Oh,
Yeah, we're just announcing.
We're helping Matt.
Oh, okay.
She left
Okay.
early.
all right.
Okay, thank you.
Thaisa, you want to start?
Hello, I'm just introducing myself first. Good afternoon to everybody. Good morning, actually. I'm calling from Algiers in Valencia. So
Wow.
I'm a student from UFMJ, the ProArt, from ProArt. I'm Thaisa Malaquias, and my professor, tutor professor, is Ana Mora. She's watching us here too. So actually, what I'm doing here now is talk about the two texts that we had to read today.
Good.
And the decoration and sorry, can I share the screen?
Yes.
Yes, it's muted.
She'd like to share the screen.
It's not
Okay.
able to share screen.
Let's see if we can
I'm
get
not
it
allowed
to work.
share.
Fala com o Bruno.
We might need a little technical assistance. The computer here has been a bit dicey.
Ele liberou?
Can you do it from your end?
I think she's trying, but she can't do it.
She can't do
Okay,
it.
now it's
Some
ready.
images
Okay.
problems.
Okay, so we
Just a second.
need, unfortunately, to get someone. I think we'll get him, but it might be a little bit. I don't know if you want to start talking and then show the images. Oh, great, great. Okay, we've got the screen shared. We don't see you, but we see the screen.
The screen?
Just, we see the
It's okay,
screen.
right?
Yeah, we see the screen.
Okay. So I will start, like, as I said,
Yeah,
I'm
there
a
we see it.
PhD student from the ProArt program from UFMJ, the Federal University from Rio de Janeiro. And I'm studying architecture, women architecture, and the modern movement, like criticism of the domestic spaces. So I will talk about the two texts that we have to read today. That the first one, I will introduce the Making Room book, and the article that we're talking today is from Leslie Kane Blakeman, The Women Environmental Rights, a Manifesto. And she begins saying that a passage that architecture has an icon, and the manifesto highlights how the built environment closer to private spaces reflects and enforces patriarchal norms that limits women's autonomy and identity. It argues that art perpetuates gender stereotypes, oppressing women and restricting their access to spaces and opportunities. The classification that the house is a spatial and temporal metaphor for conventional display. In the text, that enlightens about the woman's role in domestic architecture. The text critiques the traditional division of gender roles in architecture, where women are primarily associated with domestic spaces, such as the home and the kitchen, perpetuate gender stereotypes, and limit women's autonomy by confining them to the same spaces. Patriarchy and urban architecture. In addition to domestic spaces, the manifesto also criticizes urban architecture, highlighting how skyscrapers and public spaces reflect male power and domination. Skyscrapers are described as silos of completely masculine ego, while public spaces exclude and limit women.
Amazing. Sorry to interrupt you. The presentation, Teresa?
Yes.
The presentation is not moving.
It's not moving?
No, it's the same first page.
The first?
Yeah.
But for me it's going normally, so I don't know if that it's a connection issue. But can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we can see it. We
It
only
starts in the first page, right? The first slide.
PowerPoint. We can see the PowerPoint.
But it's not going to
move. I feel like you have to
Não
change.
está full. Não está full, Tair.
Yeah. Let's try again, sorry.
Compartilha a tela toda do computador, eu acho que funciona melhor.
Yeah.
Sugere que ela faça pergunta, porque como a revista já se ligou, pelo menos, bom, aqui se não em Porto Alegre, nem São Paulo.
Yeah. Everybody sees the screen?
The same.
Yeah.
Continua assim, tá.
Agora foi. Tá ótimo. Obrigada.
Okay. These were the slides I was passing and but it's just the image of the people. And I was talking about the domestic architecture, I talked about the skyscrapers, and there's images from the book from Louis, like architecture from like Sullivan and the skyscrapers from modern movement too. And well, the next is fragmentation of feminine identity. The separation between public and private spheres, according to traditional gender roles, reinforces stereotypes and limits mutual understanding between men and women. This fragmentation prevents both sexes from developing a complete understanding of themselves and each other. Spatial and cultural segregation. Segregation of spaces according to gender roles limits skill acquisition and reinforces emotional and behavioral stereotypes associated with the traditional view that women are responsible for the domestic sphere while men occupy the public sphere. And proposals for change and empowerment. Feminist architecture. The manifest proposes feminist architecture that transcends gender division and promotes equality and inclusion. This involves creating spaces that support women's autonomy, encourage cooperation and protection, and integrate work and personal life equitably. And for the next, remaining public space. The manifesto suggests remaining public spaces training, breastfeeding, and diaper changes spaces, as well as design buildings and public areas that consider the needs of our areas. Conclusions. Wellman provoked patriarchal norms and tensions in architecture and urban planning. She advocates for inclusive spaces that transcend traditional gender roles, urging a reevaluation of public environments to accommodate diverse needs. She underscores the necessity of challenging gender biases based inequality to foster more equitable youth-run landscapes, making her manifesto a pivotal contribution to discussions on feminist issues. Thus, Wellman Manifesto serves as a catalyst for scholarly discourse and practical initiatives aimed at reimagining the urban private through a feminist lens. And the next, the second text that we have to discuss today is the feminine music. This is a more famous work from the 60s, from Latin Scripture. And the feminine mystic, Friedman defines the feminine mystic as the ideal that verifies the role of women as housewives and mothers, suggesting that true female fulfillment could only be found in this role. She argues that the view limited women's potential and prevented them from seeking other forms of personal and professional fulfillment. The problem has no name. Friedman describes the problem has no name, referring to the widespread feeling of unhappiness and emptiness experienced by many women who, despite fulfilling their idealized roles of wife and mother, have profound dissatisfaction. She collected accounts of women who felt isolated and purposeless, despite having everything. And educational and social conformity. Friedman criticizes how women's education has directed to prepare them exclusively for the domestic world. Schools and universities encourage courses that enforce domestic skills and discourage careers or intellectual interests that could lead to laziness. The role of media and popular culture. The author examines how the media, including women's magazines, television programs, and advertising, once they promoted the feminine mystic, will find domestic life and portraying independent professionalism as abnormal or dissatisfied figures. And the influence of psychology and psychoanalysis. Criticizes present psychology that dominated the thinking of time, suggesting that it contributed to the reinforcing the idea that women should find satisfaction only in domestic work. She argues that psychology and therapists often patronizes women's ambitions and desires to seek something beyond the home. And for the end, the empty wide hearing and its impact on mental health. The author explores how conformity to the feminine mystic contributed to mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and a sense of worthlessness. She suggests that the repression of women's true desires and talents led to a profound psychological distress. Path to liberation. Friedman argues that women should seek education and careers that fulfill them, and that society should support equal opportunity for both sexes. She believes that personal fulfillment and gender equality would benefit not only women, but society as a whole. And in conclusion, the feminist movement, the group concludes with a call for a new feminist movement that would fight for equal rights, work and education opportunities, and for a society that did not restrict women to the limited roles. This book remains an essential reading for understanding the origins of modern feminism and the challenge that continues to
some thoughts too in the room. What do you think are the limits of Friedan's book? That first chapter is really a response to the post-World War II culture, women in suburbia, restricted to their suburban lifestyle, driving their children around, not working, etc., although Friedan herself worked. Do you find it's obviously a very old critique, 63. I think you did a great job showing what she's arguing and the positive side of it. Is there a side that now seems dated, or a group of women left out, or the limits of her critique? I would ask all of you. And the same we could ask about...
Your point. It's kind of the limits. I guess something changes from the 60s, but I guess it's a matter of access of all the spaces. Like, we still have gender roles, that women still belong to the house, but still have to work outside the house. So the matter when freedom decided that in the 60s, it was a matter of like the men, their family had a car, a house, kids, and the car belonged to the men, so people would go to the city and explore the outside world. Meanwhile, the women were confined in their houses, so it was like more limited. So I guess today, when women are like, how can I say, women are occupying for the spaces, working, like it's been decades that we are in the situation, but we still have the same issues, like problems with access, like we still have like the problem with the security, the problem with working with your children. I forgot how to say the careers that you carry the baby. So we have problems with accessible spaces for the women or old people to walk by the street. So actually we still have problems, limitations that like it's not just a gender issue, but it's a problem of access for everyone.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think you brought up some interesting things. One thing that I always felt reading Betty Friedan, in some ways she awakens all these women in suburbia to the limitations of their life and this frustration they feel that they don't have a name for it. The title is indicative. But I think in hindsight, we felt like she left out a lot of women. Women living in central cities, women that weren't in suburbia, women of color, working class women who never not worked. And so it was a very good book for motivating middle class American women, but we felt, I think that's later why the issue of intersectionality got raised, and the issue of the charge that some of American feminism was simply too white. Although there were very important black early feminists, I think of Bell Hook as one, but the audience was a particular kind of woman. And so I think we might now, in hindsight, give her so much credit for raising issues, but also say that it wasn't maybe enough, that we needed to do more. I don't know how all of you...
When you're talking about the data, it's something that is dated. It is, like it's not enough to explain the problem today with the access to the urban space, like public spaces or domestic spaces.
Yeah, well that certainly remained, and that was very true in the Leslie Wiseman. I'm curious what all of you think. That idea that we brought it up yesterday, that public spaces, at least now we have changing rooms and bathrooms in some airports and things, but we still have this inequity of how many skyscrapers have daycare facilities in them? How many skyscrapers really allow for women to be nursing their children while they're working? These are still issues, and you could say the Wiseman article, in arguing so strongly that we shouldn't, which also the Friedan does, that women shouldn't just be in the residential realm and that they need to be in the public realm. All I was trying to say is that division was exaggerated by class. That working class women were always not just in the home, because many of them worked. And the whole issue of this suburban car culture, which you probably still feel like is true in LA and to some extent in Rio, where people drive a lot. But for a city like where I live in New York, where the majority of people do not own cars, it doesn't seem so relevant. But there are plenty of suburban women living on the outside of New York that certainly experienced what she's talking about when she wrote the book. What she was really inspired by, she went to a very good women's college, Smith, and she went to a college reunion, and all of these brilliant women at Smith were feeling anxious, unhappy, dissatisfied with their life. They weren't using their brains, and they weren't using their capacity. That however fulfilling being a mother was, or raising children, there were other dimensions of their being that somehow weren't addressed. But do we have other problems today? Do you have the phrase in Brazil of the second shift?
Yes.
Yes. Where women will be both working, and even if the husbands pitch in or the partners pitch in, they still feel like they have the majority of the child care. What did you feel reading the text, those others in the room, or? Yeah, go.
Don't you want to say?
I didn't know if anyone else, I truly don't want to exclude anyone else who prepared remarks, but thank you so much. That was a very good summary of Wiseman and Friedan.
Okay, I will turn off my video, and thank you all for the attention. Thank you, Mary.
No, not us. We thank you.
Very nice to chat with you. I'm honored. Thank you so much.
No, it was excellent summary of the thought. You got it.
I'm particularly really curious about everything you're saying, and the readings always evokes in me a lot of questions and reflections, because I'm always confronting it with the queer theory that is some kind of way a little bit more or less different.
Yes.
And that's why I'm going to.
Sure.
The one thing was that for the problem that has no name, I was wondering if as a paradox, if the development of the automation of the kitchen did not gain free time for those suburban women to reflect on those issues. I was wondering about that.
I think that's an excellent point, because they suddenly had more time, new appliances, efficient kitchens, and there were two strategies. Either you cooked more elaborate meals and had more fancy entertainment, or you thought about what else you should do with your life. So I totally agree with your first point.
And the second is about in the manifesto, and you're saying about those programs spaced for directly to women to breastfeed their children and everything. And while that, I was wondering about what we were talking about yesterday, about differentiation, and how can that apply in the architectural design, as we always are programming things to a determined function. And as well as we do in our daily life and public spaces as disciplinatory embodied spaces, and as control devices, reminding the Foucault's idea. And I was wondering, as how can we, like in theoretical, need to specify more programmatic spaces, or deprogram it at all? Oh, so as you say, if we can only, going back to the bathroom issue, if we only change the sign, it changed its program. So how can we only, how this and again a language problem, that how we name things. So this is a room for breastfeeding. Aren't we like separating from the public spaces and the common spaces? Or should we deprogram it so everything could be a place for breastfed children?
You know, maybe we need both options. I always think I talked to Dolores Hayden about kitchens. But, you know, I told you I had an unfortunate obsession. And we were talking about open kitchens. There's a very good, I'm mispronouncing her name, a wonderful Portuguese architect, Ana Puljaner, who is now at ETH. She taught for a while at Columbia, and she was very interested in kitchenless houses and communal kitchens, just like some of the early feminist theorists were. And she became friendly when she taught one term at Yale with Dolores Hayden, where she was teaching. But Dolores and I both said we like our kitchen separate from our dining room because we don't want to show our mess when we're cooking. But others enjoy the communal atmosphere. And I'm all for choice. I guess, and I feel the same, some women may feel shy breastfeeding in public. Other women, it should be it's legal, by the way, in New York to breastfeed in public. And I know, but I still I'd go to an art gallery when I had my daughter, this is many years ago, and I'd go in Soho on a staircase to breastfeed her because I didn't quite feel comfortable doing it in the middle. I didn't want to be the one on display. But I think, maybe it's too easy an answer, but I call for diversity. It's interesting with Leslie Wiseman. I think you should know that she herself is lesbian. She was involved with a woman, Phyllis Birkby, who was also a very important early architectural feminist. But they both seem to identify at this point more with women's issues than lesbian issues. But it did become an issue in the organization called NOW, National Organization for Women, that Betty Friedan was involved with, where some lesbians felt like the NOW was too accommodating. All they wanted to do was become equal to men and not radically transform lives. So there was a split between some lesbian feminists and some straight feminists. But at that moment in time, very different from now, where I think both lesbian and gay men calling themselves queer identify more with this idea of destroying boundaries and divisions and increase kind of fluidity. But at that moment in time, it was very important, if you will, to have an enemy, to fight a specific position as opposed to another position. And I think we all have this issue with identity politics too. On one moment, it's very good to single out your particular issue. I'm queer, therefore I want to fight those issues. I'm a woman, therefore I want to fight those issues. I'm a Mexican American, so I want to fight Mexican American status in California or whatever. The trouble is you forget other issues, like class. My students, I don't know if this is true in Brazil, but I was of a generation where we were kind of new leftists. We read our Marxist theory. We all spoke class as well as feminism. But class is a word my students hardly ever use. They'll worry about queer issues, they'll worry about gender issues, they'll worry about post-colonial theory. They don't worry about class. And that worries me when there's so many impoverished people in the world. So I don't know how you all feel about those terms, or how you felt reading even Leslie Wiseman's statement. I thought that was a good point, though. Do you want separate spaces, or do you want everything open? I used to get frustrated with Bernard Schumi, who was my colleague at Columbia. We were quite friendly. But he'd always talk about all this programming, cross-programming. And I thought the empty box where anything could happen was just as good for cross-programming as calculating that you're going to put a running track next to a film studio or whatever. He was all into forcing the diversity. And I think there's always a question how much architecture should do it, how much participants should do it. But thinking about programming is obviously part of our responsibility. I know it's lunchtime, but any other thoughts? Or people who prepared remarks? There's also tomorrow.
There's a question.
Okay.
Monica?
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said, Mary, about programming. I prefer all open because you can integrate. When I cook in my kitchen that is closed, I feel very separated from the you know, that what is happening on the house. So this is one thing, and other, I think we have a huge cultural problem and education problem about women. You know, I saw an exhibition in New York at the public library about Darby.
About
and
what?
there is a phrase that someone asked him that.
Sorry, Monica, what was the exhibition about?
Darby.
Our gardens?
The guy that did the theory of the evolution. You know?
Oh, Darwin. Okay,
Darwin.
sorry, I
Yeah.
understand.
And there is a part of this book that someone asked him if women are less capable of men. You know, because they don't have access to education and opportunities to learn things. And he said that no, that women are more capable than men, but they don't have the opportunity to learn. And I think this is still happen today. This is very sad, you know. In architecture, if you are a woman and you work in the construction, it's always very hard that the man trust in your information, you know.
I agree with you, and I think it's slowly changing, but not quickly enough. My former husband's firm was curtain walls, and it was a very male, high skyscrapers. But I'm very happy to say, as he's pulling back, given that he's older, it's going to be a woman partner who will basically is taking over the firm. And I see these changes, but if you look at Columbia Engineering School, still majority men. I don't know if that's true in Brazil. It's changing. One of the things that's very encouraging, and I don't like to generalize about ethnic stereotypes, but a lot of Asian American women are going into engineering, and I hope that changes things. But there are certain fields that we feel are still very stereotypical. I think there are very few women brain surgeons, for instance. Surgery, there are now women doing breast cancer surgery, gynecological surgery, but there's still huge stereotypes. And I think we have lots of work. I would agree with you, even in architecture, getting rid of those divisions. But also not denigrating those fields associated with women, like domesticity, interiors, etc. I think we need to work at both ends. Thank you, Monica, so much. Okay, so if you have other questions or we're going to present, let me know, but we'll make sure there's time tomorrow. And I promise only one talk tomorrow.